It was already past midnight. I sat in my car, exhausted and drained after a long shift. My head buzzed from the monotonous hum of the engine and the street sounds seeping through the partially open window. My plan was simple: drive home, collapse onto my bed, and slip into a restless sleep. But when my phone suddenly pinged with a new ride request, I glanced at the screen. The surge rate for the ride was enticingly high, too high to pass up. It could cover the gas expenses and still leave me with enough for breakfast. "All right," I muttered to myself, snapping the phone shut. One last ride. The destination was in a residential area on the south side of the city, a neighborhood where the houses looked like drab boxes lined up in monotonous rows. By the time I arrived, the streets felt nearly abandoned, empty, dark, with long shadows stretching across the asphalt. The streetlights were out, leaving the neighborhood in an unnatural darkness, broken only by the beam of my car's headlights. I slowly turned onto the designated street, and there, as if emerging from the thick ink of night, a silhouette appeared before me. In the headlights, I saw a man in a long, dark coat. The hood was pulled low over his head, hiding his face in shadow, and to be honest, he looked unnervingly eerie. His entire figure radiated something unsettling, almost ominous. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I slowly reached under my seat, where my only means of protection lay: a Glock 19. Simple, reliable, legally purchased back when I thought that life in this city might genuinely turn dangerous. I kept it for self-defense, though I couldn't recall ever truly needing to use it. For a moment, feeling my heartbeat pounding in my temples, I checked to make sure the gun was still there, then sat back up and took a deep breath. Just a regular ride, just another passenger. Keep it together. I pulled closer and the passenger side door slowly creaked open. The man in the coat slid into the back seat with a quiet, almost unsettling grace. A damp, musty smell wafted into the car, as if he had just emerged from some cold, grim cellar. He settled in behind me, and the car's interior felt smaller, as if filled with some invisible pressure. "Good evening," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. But the words hung in the air, frozen. The man said nothing. He only gave a brief nod, and I noticed his pale hand gripping the edge of his coat tightly. Our destination was on the outskirts of the city, a place I only knew by rumor. An area of endless construction sites and scattered half-abandoned houses standing amidst overgrown lots. We drove in silence, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. My passenger sat perfectly still, like a statue, but a sense of unease radiated from him. Something was off. I couldn't pinpoint what, but every instinct I had screamed of danger, reminding me over and over. We passed through sleepy, deserted neighborhoods where rows of identical houses loomed ominously under the rare, flickering streetlights. The ride should have taken about 20 minutes, but the time dragged on endlessly. I tried to focus on driving, but my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, checking to make sure the strange passenger remained calm. Every moment I anticipated some sudden move, a gesture that would force me to react, grab the gun, do anything. And then finally, it happened. The man began to lift his hands slowly. I tensed, every muscle in my body turning to steel. But he only pushed back his hood, revealing his face. It was gaunt, with sharp, almost sickly cheekbones and skin so pale it seemed to be cracking, like a mask about to shatter. His eyes were the most striking part, bright green like emeralds, with a cold, predatory glint that seemed far from human. For a moment, I thought they glowed, like the eyes of a beast tracking its prey in the night. He spoke suddenly. His voice was low, velvety, and almost soothing, like the lullaby of a predator, lulling its victim before the fatal strike. There was something hypnotic yet deeply unsettling about it, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. I gripped the steering wheel harder, trying not to let my fear show. "What does murder mean?" he asked, his question catching me off guard. I turned my head, puzzled. Was it a threat? A provocation? Why bring that up? My throat went dry and my heartbeat raced. But he continued, his tone almost philosophical, delving into strange and disturbing reflections. "Humans kill living things every day," he began, with the faintest hint of a smile. "A cockroach crushed in a moment of panic. A cow slaughtered so that its flesh becomes a delicious steak for dinner. It's all murder, isn't it? But no one pauses to consider the morality of these actions. No one feels remorse. They justify it as a necessity of survival. They justify it to maintain a sense of righteousness." His words sank into me, sending chills across my skin. He spoke smoothly, confidently, as though he had pondered this topic for a long time and was ready for any argument. His emerald gaze remained fixed on my reflection, and I felt almost hypnotized. "But," he continued, his voice dropping to a soft whisper, "when a human is killed, everything changes. People start shouting words like sin, immoral, monstrous. They cry out for laws, for justice. Why? What makes human life sacred while the lives of other creatures are so disposable?" I had no answer. His words were both inhuman and disturbingly logical. He spoke with a detached coldness, like a scientist dissecting a living being devoid of any value. "Humans justify killing when it serves their well-being," he went on, his gaze shifting to his thin fingers, which drummed lightly against his knees. "And so, they consider it normal. But imagine if in one horrific moment a human found themselves in the place of the animal. If they became the prey, the food for something stronger, more adapted. Would that murder still be a sin?" He turned to look at me, a wild, predatory flicker passing through his eyes. "Why?" he whispered, his voice gentle but laced with threat. "Why, if you kill a cow, it's called a dinner. But if you kill a human, it becomes the gravest crime. Don't predators justify themselves in the same way when they hunt? Don't they live in harmony with nature? Why do humans equate murder with sin when it comes to their own, yet view the killing of animals as a right to exist?" His words resonated through me, a cold echo settling deep in my bones. I gripped the wheel tighter, realizing that the person sitting behind me wasn't just philosophizing. What is this psycho trying to say? I thought, feeling cold sweat slide down my neck. The idea of just kicking him out briefly crossed my mind, but I dismissed it immediately. I didn't want to start a confrontation in the middle of the night on a deserted road. Better to tough it out, drop him off, and be rid of this strange passenger once and for all. The man continued to bore into me with his stare, as if waiting for me to ask a question. Under that piercing, almost hypnotic gaze, I couldn't help myself. I swallowed and asked, "You talk as if there are creatures that feed on humans, but when it comes to ordinary wild animals, attacking a person is usually a mistake, because humans aren't part of their food chain. So, who exactly are you talking about?" The man's lips curled into a subtle, sinister smile. He paused, as if considering my words, then leisurely scratched his nose and said, "Let's say there were beings that fed solely on human flesh. Do you think it would justify their killing humans just to survive?" My heart began to pound even harder. Every instinct screamed that this man was insane, a psychopath. But what did he want from me? What answer was he fishing for? I bit my lip, and after a moment of thought, cautiously replied, From a human's perspective, any killing is a sin. Humanity sees itself as the pinnacle of nature, the ruler of this world. So an attack on a human is perceived as a threat to the entire species. People wouldn't just stand by and do nothing. Even when a cheetah hunts a gazelle, the gazelle fights back. Humans, unlike animals, can coordinate, unite, and defend themselves. That's also part of their right to survival, just like any predator's right. The man listened intently, nodding, and something like satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "You're right," he said with a disturbingly warm tone. "But these days, everyone talks about rights, about how everyone deserves something. But what then should be done about creatures that only want to survive by feeding on humans?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. This was one of those questions without a clear, logical answer, especially when sitting in the dark next to a terrifying stranger. "Sir, are you talking about cannibalism?" I asked, my voice trembling. His eyes lit up with a twisted joy, but he shook his head. "No," he said, drawing out the word. "I wouldn't call it cannibalism. Let's say it's another species, a higher species, so there's nothing to debate." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to maintain any semblance of calm. "Look, I'm just a taxi driver, not a philosopher. And those creatures don't exist, right? So why even think about it?" He smiled again, but this time the smile was chilling, almost predatory. There was no joy, no warmth, just something feral, alien. He silently pulled the hood back over his face, signaling that our conversation was over. But the fear clung to me, wrapping tighter around my throat as I drove, feeling the night closing in. We continued in a tense silence, and I kept replaying his words. He's definitely a psycho, I thought, feeling my heart hammer erratically in my chest. The darkness around us seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the last glimmers of light, and his unsettling monologue still made my skin crawl. Finally, we reached our destination. It was a quiet, modest neighborhood lined with small, weathered houses, all gray and worn. I pulled up to one of them, forcing myself to breathe evenly, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The man began to pay, but as he handed me the money, something strange happened. His hand, pale and skeletal, unexpectedly grabbed mine. His fingers were ice-cold and claw-like. Terror shot through me, and I instinctively yanked my hand back, eyes widening in fright. "What are you doing?" I blurted out, barely holding back the tremor in my voice. The man slowly fixed his emerald eyes on me. They no longer seemed human, more like those of a beast, predatory and merciless. He leaned closer, and I caught the scent of damp earth emanating from him. "If you call the police," he said, his voice soft and chillingly calm, "I'll come for you. Just go home." His fingers tightened one last time before releasing me, as though discarding something useless. He got out of the car, leaving me paralyzed with shock and fear. I watched him disappear, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. Who is this guy? What is he planning? Anxiety coiled tight in my chest, but I needed to leave, to obey, to forget this whole nightmare. Yet a nagging suspicion had already taken root. This man intended something terrible, and his warning sent a shiver down to the marrow of my bones. As soon as the door slammed shut, I pulled away, driving slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. Not my business, I told myself. But as I drove further, I turned into a nearby alley. I stopped. Curiosity? Worry? Or my damn tendency to meddle? Maybe it was my father's influence. The hero complex Mom always said had gotten him killed. "All right," I muttered, deciding. "Fine." I stepped out of the car as quietly as possible and gently shut the door. My heart pounded wildly. Reaching under the seat, I retrieved my Glock 19. My fingers trembled, but holding the gun gave me a shred of courage. I crept toward the house, using bushes as cover. Through the branches, I saw the man standing before the door, tall and still, like a statue of death. A light glowed on the second floor and someone was pacing inside. The man tilted his head as if listening, then looked at the door as though contemplating. Time seemed to crawl, each second stretching endlessly. I held my breath. He glanced at his watch, then gripped the doorknob and yanked it with disturbing strength. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. The metal bent, yielding like butter, and the lock crumbled. What the hell is that? This wasn't a human being. Couldn't be. My back was drenched in cold sweat as I watched him effortlessly swing the door open and slip inside, silent as a shadow. Panic seized me, and I pulled out my phone. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The dial tone seemed to stretch forever, but when the operator answered, I nearly shouted into the phone. "Please, send a patrol to this neighborhood at..." My voice broke, but I forced myself to speak clearly. I explained the situation, pleading for the police to hurry. They promised to dispatch help, but the wait felt eternal. I crouched low, the gun clutched tightly in my hand, and watched the house. A silhouette moved behind the upstairs curtain. It was the man, but then something horrifying happened. His shape began to distort. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating, but no. His body twisted, broadened, and his hands stretched into long, clawed limbs. The curtain billowed as though a monster were being born behind it. Oh, God! A woman's scream pierced the night, sending a spike of dread through me. God, what do? I gripped the gun, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Screw it! I cursed under my breath and dashed toward the house, fear forgotten, driven only by the desperate need to help and stop this abomination. I gathered my courage, and trying to sound more confident than I felt, shouted, "Police, stay where you are!" My voice sliced through the silence like a knife, and to my surprise, it triggered an immediate response. From inside the house came an inhuman roar that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Then, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. I bolted forward, skipping steps, and when I reached the second floor, I froze, gripped by a mix of terror and desperation. Blood droplets were scattered across the worn carpet, bright red against the faded fabric. The window was shattered, thin streaks of blood trickling down the frame. I realized that whatever creature this was, it had escaped, taking its victim with it. My heart clenched with a suffocating sense of helplessness and guilt. Damn. I was too late. My shout had only provoked the beast, and now someone's life might be irrevocably shattered. Collecting my thoughts, I cautiously scanned the night outside the broken window, but saw nothing. I was on edge, my fingers still gripping the gun, ready for any threat. Every shadow looked suspicious, and any movement made me want to shoot. Minutes later, the screech of tires and the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. The police arrived, flooding the street with lights and barking commands. I made my way downstairs, the fear and tension draining away, leaving me exhausted. Carefully, I placed the gun on the ground and raised my hands. Several officers immediately pointed their weapons at me. "Hands up, don't move!" one of them shouted. I stood still, barely daring to breathe. They rushed over, twisting my arms behind my back and dragging me to a patrol car. As officers moved into the house to investigate, one remained beside me, bombarding me with questions. I was still in shock, but managed to get out. "I called you." I explained everything that had happened, doing my best to keep my voice steady, but I kept the details about the transformation to myself. I knew no one would believe me. If I told the truth, they'd think I was crazy, and that would only make things worse. They took me to the station for questioning. The questions came in rapid succession, but I stuck to my story. I described hearing a scream and seeing the intruder escape through the window, carrying a woman. Eventually, they let me go, and I asked one of the officers what they had discovered. He told me, "The woman who lived there was named Sarah. She was 40 years old, lived alone." Those words echoed in my mind as they drove me back to my car. I finally sat behind the wheel, feeling the crushing weight of exhaustion and despair. The drive home was empty, but my head was full of turmoil. I made a mistake. Or had I done the right thing? I could have driven away and not gotten involved, but I knew I wouldn't have been able to live with that. A gnawing feeling lingered, a certainty that this was only the beginning of something much worse. The next morning, as I struggled to piece my thoughts together, the police came to my house again. They asked for the dashcam footage. I didn't argue, letting them take whatever they needed, but I reminded them that the man had threatened me. One of the officers assured me that the police would keep things under control and suggested I stay home for a few days. Reluctantly, I agreed to take some time off and try to regain my composure. The day passed sluggishly, drained of energy. I forced myself to make lunch, though I had little appetite. When I opened the fridge, I saw that my supplies were almost gone. Just a few eggs, an old jar of sauce, and half a block of cheese. I'll have to go to the store tomorrow, I thought, but today I didn't even have the strength. I cooked a simple omelet, ate, and then sprawled in front of the TV, trying to forget the horrors of the previous night. Tomorrow, I'd have to visit Mom in the hospital. On the way, I could swing by the supermarket for groceries. Repeating that thought like a mantra, I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my bedroom. My room was dark, familiar shadows filling the corners. I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind spun with thoughts of the strange man, his words, his unsettling philosophy about life and death. What had I really seen? Was it a monster, or had my imagination twisted reality in fear? Or had that psycho truly leapt out of the window with some inhuman strength? I tossed and turned, soaking my pillow with sweat, trying to calm the relentless questions. Hours passed, and I finally gave up. I picked up my phone and glanced at the screen. 2 a.m. Frustrated by insomnia, I decided to go to the kitchen for some water. As I got up and walked to the window, I glanced outside and froze. The darkness outside seemed thicker, more suffocating. And then I saw it. Between 2 streetlights, a figure stood in the shadows. Clad in a hooded coat, his face was obscured by the dark, but I had no doubt that he was looking directly at me. My heart stopped, then started pounding wildly, as if trying to burst out of my chest. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. It was him. The same man standing in the street, staring up at my bedroom window, as if he could see me, see how I was watching him. An inner voice screamed at me to act, and I grabbed my phone. My hands shook as I dialed the police. They arrived quickly, sirens shattering the night's stillness. But when the officers searched the area, there was no sign of the man. He had vanished, melting into the darkness as if he'd never been there. I realized then that this wasn't just fear. It was a real warning. I was in danger. The next day, I felt sluggish, a ghost drifting through my house. The police assured me that they would station a patrol car nearby to watch my home at night. but even that promise of security couldn't dispel the creeping dread. After a rushed breakfast, I prepared to visit Mom in the hospital. On the way, I stopped at the supermarket. I grabbed a cart and mechanically, like a robot, filled it with essentials: bread, milk, frozen dinners, coffee. At one point, I froze, catching myself staring into the glass door of the dairy case, as if expecting to see a familiar silhouette reflected there. Shaking myself out of it, I quickly paid for the groceries and left. Soon, I pulled up to the hospital. A large, grim building with gray walls and glass doors, bustling with patients and doctors. The air smelled of disinfectant and the faint, unpleasant scent of hospital food. I walked down the corridor to Mom's room, feeling detached, as if observing myself from the outside. Mom lay in bed, an IV drip attached to her frail arm. Pale and tired, she lifted her head when she saw me, and I forced a smile, trying to hide my worry. Her hands were cold, and I clasped them, feeling a wave of guilt crash over me. I had brought something dark and dangerous into my life, and now I feared it could threaten her too. I sat down on the chair next to Mom's hospital bed, trying not to let my inner turmoil show. "How are you feeling?" I asked, forcing a smile. She smiled back, though she looked pale and tired. "Oh, I'm doing just fine, sweetheart," she replied softly, as if trying to reassure me more than herself. Of course, there was no way I was going to tell her what I'd been through in the past 24 hours or about the danger now hanging over us. We chatted about random things: her hospital roommates, the quality of the hospital food, good and bad. Mom spoke with a gentle warmth, and I did my best to keep up the light conversation until she said, "By the way, your friend came by recently." I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. "A friend?" I echoed, not fully grasping what she had said. Mom nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, he spoke so highly of you. He found out I was here and rushed over with a gift basket." She gestured to a woven basket on the table beside her bed. I turned my head and leaned in to get a better look. The basket was filled with fruit, chocolate, and a small stuffed animal. A sense of dread coiled in my gut, tightening like icy fingers around my heart. I forced a smile. "A friend? What did he say his name was?" Mom chuckled lightly, oblivious to my panic. "He said his name was John Doe. Funny name, right?" I struggled to hide my fear, but my blood ran cold. John Doe. I didn't know anyone by that name, but there was no doubt who it had to be. "What did he look like?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Mom described him, and the image was all too familiar. Gaunt face, sharp cheekbones, piercing green eyes, dark hood. It was him. The very man who had turned my life upside down. A wave of cold terror washed over me. He had found my weakness, my mother. The horror gripped me, but I forced myself to smile, chat a little longer, and assure her I'd be back soon. I kissed her forehead, promising to return the next day, and left the room feeling shattered and powerless. Damn. As I drove home, my thoughts spiraled, one crashing into the next. What kind of mess have I gotten into? Why didn't I listen and just go home when he told me to? Now my mother is in danger. What do I do? Going to the police seemed logical, but I was terrified. Afraid that if he found out, he'd actually hurt her. Back home, I was still in a state of panic and exhaustion. I unloaded the groceries, sorting them on the kitchen counter, but suddenly stopped when I noticed something on the table. A white envelope, ordinary but ominous, with my name written in black ink. To Michael, from your very best friend. My heart pounded, feeling like it might burst from my chest. Hands shaking, I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a note and a photograph. I looked at the photo first and felt an even deeper chill. It showed my mother sitting in her hospital bed, smiling a tired, forced smile. Beside her stood him, the man with the gaunt face and piercing gaze. He wasn't smiling, just staring into the camera with eyes that sent an icy dread through me. I set the photo down and unfolded the note. "I warned you not to call the police. Now I won't let you off the hook. And I won't have to explain that if you make any more mistakes, I know exactly where your mother is. Right? So no cops and no more foolishness. Come to this address next Monday at exactly 12 o'clock. This is your final warning. No cops." As I read the note, I realized I was trapped, completely ensnared. This psychopath had no intention of backing off. If I involved the police, I'd be putting my mother's life in mortal danger. My heart thundered in my chest, and a mix of fear and helplessness swept over me. What do I do? How do I get out of this nightmare? The week passed in a blur. The police patrolled my house for a couple of days, then left, assuring me that everything was fine. They told me to call if anything happened, but their reassurances did little to comfort me. I had to return to work eventually, as my mother's hospital bills weren't going to pay themselves. But the thought of the upcoming meeting with John Doe never left my mind. I kept trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, this was all in my head. That he was just a deranged man, not a monster, and that things weren't as dire as they seemed. But as Monday approached, the anxiety wrapped around my heart like an icy vice, growing tighter by the hour. At one point, I even went to a gun shop and bought something more serious. A Remington 870 shotgun, powerful and reliable. I stashed it under my car seat, a last-ditch measure if things went horribly wrong. Monday arrived. I barely slept, nerves stretched to their breaking point. All day I paced the house, feeling like every shadow held a threat. As midnight approached, I knew there was no turning back. I got in my car and drove to the address he had given me. The location was a rundown neighborhood, full of one-story houses with peeling paint and yards overgrown with weeds. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a street lamp in the darkness. When I arrived, I saw him. John Doe was waiting, standing under a streetlight whose glow seemed to bend strangely around his figure. He stood perfectly still, but his very presence felt threatening, as though the night itself recoiled from him. I pulled up and he calmly approached, opening the back door and sliding into the car. That familiar scent of damp earth and something wild filled the cabin. "Drive," he said softly, and I obeyed, my fingers clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He didn't say where we were going, and I nervously glanced at the rearview mirror. John was staring at me with a thin, unsettling smile, as if relishing my fear. Unable to bear the tension, I finally asked, "Where are we going?" His smile widened, his eyes glinting in the headlights. "Don't you think you owe me an apology first? For breaking your promise?" he said with a mocking tone. I winced, remembering his warning not to involve the police. Panic constricted my chest and I gripped the wheel even harder. "I'm sorry," I managed, my voice trembling. "I was stupid." He leaned back, satisfied. "That's better," he said. But then he pulled a photograph from his coat pocket, the same one of my mother in her hospital bed. "From now on, you're going to be my driver," he added with a chilling ease. The photograph looked innocent enough in his hands, but I knew the threat it carried was deadly. Rage flared in me, but I forced myself to stay silent. His threats might have seemed childish, but I knew better. This man, or creature, whatever he was dangerous beyond comprehension. I clenched my teeth, suppressing the urge to confront him right then and there. Not yet, I told myself. Play along until there's an opening. Growing bored of waiting for a response, he carelessly tossed the photo onto the seat beside me, as if it were trash. "Drive to this address," he commanded, naming a location across town. I obeyed, driving slowly, while the empty, shadowed streets seemed to close in around us. As we drove, John hummed something under his breath, a strange melody that kept breaking off on uneven notes, like some twisted, unhealthy symphony playing inside his head. My thoughts flitted about chaotically, like a flock of frightened birds. 1,000 questions churned in my mind, but one slipped out before I could stop it. What happened to that woman? Hearing my question, John turned around, his lips twisting into a cruel smile. There was something terrible lurking behind that expression, something he was desperately trying to keep hidden. "You already know what happened to her," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. His voice was soft, but there was a threat buried in that softness. "Why ask?" "I do?" I muttered, confused and unable to grasp what he meant. But he didn't answer. He just kept looking at me through the rearview mirror, relishing my confusion. Suddenly I recalled his musings about whether it was justifiable to kill someone for survival, for food. The truth began to seep into my mind, cold and merciless. The creature behind me wasn't human. I had tangled myself up with a monster, a being that fed on people. This wasn't some fevered hallucination. It was terrifyingly real. Trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, I asked, "Isn't there another way?" John chuckled, but there wasn't a trace of humanity in that laugh. "There's always another way, but why should I bother?" His tone was light, almost playful. "The world's population is 8 billion. One less, one more. Do you have any idea how many people die in the US every day?" I held my breath, feeling the cold sink into my bones. "Almost 8,000. And you know how many are murdered? On average, 50, he said, throwing me a glance in the mirror, his eyes glittering with a chilling light. "What I do is just a tiny grain in a sea of chaos. And honestly, I don't go out of my way to pick the young and innocent. Every one of my victims has their own sins, their own darkness. So, in a way, I'm delivering justice. If you catch my drift." "Justice?" I thought bitterly. "You're just a psychopath." I wanted to say it aloud, but knew I couldn't. I realized just how dangerous he was. We fell into silence, the tension in the car so thick it was almost suffocating. I tried not to let my fear show, but my knees were trembling. Finally, we arrived at the destination. A small house surrounded by dark bushes, with no lights shining inside. Maybe we're lucky, and no one's home, I thought desperately. But John had already stepped out of the car, leaving the door ajar. I stayed where I was, guilt and fear twisting inside me, my legs itching to press the gas pedal and drive away. Then John returned and knocked on my window. Reluctantly, I rolled it down and he leaned in, a sinister smirk playing on his lips. "You know, I want you to see this for yourself, so you understand that I'm not to be trifled with. Come out and watch." My breath caught in my throat. He really wanted me to witness it, to see the murder with my own eyes. I had no choice. My heart pounded with fear, but I obeyed, climbing out of the car slowly, glancing around in the hope of spotting someone, anyone nearby. But the street was empty, eerily silent, as if the world were holding its breath for something horrible. John tugged at the door handle and it swung open, unlocked. "Lucky," he said with a smirk and stepped inside. I followed, my legs shaking, every step feeling like a march to my own doom. We crept into the house and I moved cautiously, trying not to make a sound. My knees felt weak, and the guilt and terror gnawed at my soul. I tried to steady myself, recalling his words about his victim's sins, but it didn't help. I grew up in a normal family, where murder was unthinkable, an absolute evil. We reached the bedroom. John stopped at the door and turned to me, that unsettling smile still on his face. His shoulders began to twitch, and I realized with horror that he was about to transform. I stood frozen, watching his body twist and contort. The cloak still hung around his shoulders, tied with a cord, but his arms grew longer, fingers morphing into curved claws. The skin on his face split apart, revealing dense, bristling fur. His eyes burned with a vivid, sickly green light, and his teeth elongated into deadly fangs. Before me stood a nightmare creature. The cloak was shredded in places, hanging on him and barely concealing his monstrous change. I understood then why he needed the cloak, to hide his horrifying transformation as much as possible. John stepped into the bedroom, and I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted toward the car, legs wobbling but running with every ounce of strength I had. Suddenly, a woman's scream shattered the air, short, heart-wrenching, and then came a dreadful silence. Damn it. What should I do? My heart hammered in my throat and my chest burned with terror. I was ready to floor it and get away, but I knew that the horror of this night would haunt me forever. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, feeling as though a bucket of icy water had been dumped over me. Everything in my head was a tangled, incomprehensible mess. I couldn't pull myself together, frozen in a daze, deafened by what had just happened. The horrifying truth loomed over me. Another person had been killed, and I had been an unwilling witness to that brutality. This monster, he really is a monster. My mind stubbornly resisted what I had seen. A werewolf, a real living werewolf. The existence of such creatures had always seemed like something out of folklore, confined to fairy tales and myths. But the scene I'd just witnessed had been disturbingly real. My memory replayed the image of John transforming, his beastly claws, bared fangs, and the searing hatred burning in his inhuman eyes. My world was unraveling, the line between reality and nightmare dissolving. I tried to process it, but the understanding seeped into my mind slowly, as though I couldn't bear to let the truth pierce me fully. Suddenly, the back door of the car opened, and John slid onto the rear seat. I was too terrified to look in the rearview mirror, too afraid of seeing something monstrous behind me. But with immense effort, I forced my eyes upward and saw him. Human again, though the sight did little to comfort me. His face and hands were drenched in blood, the vivid crimson stark against his pale skin. A wave of panic surged within me. Oh God. Drive, he said calmly, but his voice carried a weight that I dared not defy. I started the car and pulled away, keeping my eyes fixed on the road, too afraid to look back at him. An insane thought flashed through my mind. Maybe I could speed up and crash into something. I'd die, but maybe it'd kill this thing too. But I knew killing a werewolf wasn't that simple. I didn't want to die, but I also couldn't keep living this nightmare. John directed me where to go, and without realizing it, my foot pressed harder on the gas. My mind was splintered and scattered, and suddenly I heard John hiss angrily, "Slow down. You trying to get us caught by the cops?" His words snapped me back to my senses. I realized I was indeed speeding and eased off the gas, but it was too late. The sound of a police siren blared behind us, and my heart plunged into an icy pit. Oh no, not this. Every muscle in my body tensed as I braced for the worst. John's voice turned sharp and menacing. "Calm down and act normal. Remember your mother." His words jolted me like an electric shock. I took a deep breath, fighting to control my trembling, and pulled the car over. The officer approached, his flashlight blinding me as he pointed it through the window. I rolled it down, trying to steady my voice. "How can I help you, officer?" I asked, desperately trying to mask my panic. The officer squinted at me, then shone the light toward the back seat, making my heart stop. I silently prayed he wouldn't notice the blood. Thankfully, he didn't seem to. "Your taillight is busted," he said, illuminating me with the flashlight before moving it to John. I held my breath as the beam settled on him. The officer asked, "What are you two doing out this late?" and turned the light back to me. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice not to crack. "Driving for Uber, sir. Just taking a passenger." The officer's eyes narrowed, and I could tell he noticed how nervous I was. "You need any help?" he asked, suspicion thick in his voice. I summoned every ounce of strength I had and forced a strained smile. "No, everything's fine. Just trying to get home after this ride." He studied me for a long moment, but thankfully he didn't press the issue. "All right," he said. "I'll let you off with a warning. Get that taillight fixed." I exhaled in relief, thanked him, and waited until he stepped back before driving away. As we moved forward, I glanced at John. His face remained calm and detached, but that unbothered composure was more terrifying than any threat. Eventually, we reached the destination, a small, secluded house on the outskirts of the city. I stopped the car, and John got out. "I'll let you know when it's time for our next outing," he said evenly. I didn't respond, just nodded, and the moment he shut the door, I sped away, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I got home, the first thing I did was stumble into the shower. The water hit me in cold, heavy streams, but even that icy blast couldn't wash away the suffocating guilt and fear clinging to me. I scrubbed at my skin, desperate to cleanse myself of the night's horrors, the sticky residue of terror embedded in my mind. But the fear was too deep, ancient, like a primal instinct etched into my very DNA. The kind of fear my ancestors knew when they faced wild beasts and things that lurked in the shadows. Exhausted and haunted by the night's events, I collapsed onto the bed and passed out near dawn. When I woke up, it was already 4 in the afternoon. The sleep had taken the edge off my anxiety, like rain washing dust from a road, but only slightly. I splashed water on my face and sat down for a late lunch, still dazed and unsure of what to do next. Could I endure this again if John demanded my involvement? Should I grab my mom and run far away? But I knew she was already hanging by a thread, her health too fragile for a sudden escape. She needed care, not chaos. Searching for answers, I scoured the internet for information about monsters, werewolves, anything that might help. But all I found were fictional stories and absurd conspiracy theories, nothing useful. Frustrated, I remembered the car and went to the garage. When I opened the back door, the sight hit me like a punch. The blood-stained seat, a grotesque reminder of the night before. It was a tangible mark of the horror I had witnessed. I grabbed cleaning supplies and desperately tried to scrub the blood away. The stains had seeped into the fabric like a curse, stubborn and unyielding. I kept at it, but after several futile attempts, I gave up. I ordered new seat covers that would arrive the next day and went back to cleaning, feeling my helplessness gnaw at me. Then the doorbell rang. I froze, startled by the sudden noise. Who could that be? My heart raced as I cautiously approached the door and peered through the window. Standing there was a man I'd never seen before, dressed in a crisp business suit, his appearance impeccably neat. He wore dark sunglasses like someone from a spy movie. His hair was perfectly styled, and his clean-shaven face bore an air of formal gravity. I cracked the door open, leaving the chain in place, and asked, "Can I help you?" The man tilted his head slightly, a polite, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice even and calm. "My name is Richard Hale." He flashed an ID so quickly I barely had time to register it before he tucked it away. "I work for a special security agency," he continued. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." I opened the door a fraction wider but didn't invite him in. These days, I'd grown cautious. His questions zeroed in on the incident, that first horrible night in the ill-fated house. He wanted details, what I'd seen, anything unusual I could remember. His inquiries were precise but strangely phrased, as if he were fishing for something specific. Does he know? Does he suspect the werewolf? Fear clenched my insides. John's threat still echoed in my mind. If I talked, my mother would be in danger. Clenching my teeth, I lied. "No, nothing out of the ordinary," I said, trying to sound convincing. My heart pounded, but I knew I couldn't afford to tell the truth. Richard Hale listened intently, his expression giving nothing away. He thanked me for my time, wished me a good day, and left. As I closed the door, a wave of dread washed over me. Who is he? What does he want? And why do I feel like someone's watching my every move now? I returned to the car and resumed cleaning, but the encounter with that enigmatic man and his strange questions haunted me, adding another drop of fear to the overflowing reservoir inside me. A week passed, and I did my best to drag my life back into some semblance of normalcy. I worked like usual, visited my mom from time to time, but I always felt suspended in midair, as if standing at the edge of a cliff. Any unexpected sound, any rustle, any sudden movement made me flinch. An ever-present fear lingered, a gnawing dread that another note would appear with a sinister command. And, of course, it happened. On Saturday morning, when I walked into the kitchen, a shock of icy lightning shot through me. A new note lay on the table. I didn't want to open it, hoping I was imagining things, but my heart was already pounding, bracing for the worst. It ordered me to be at a new address on Monday at noon. Damn it. It's happening again. My head spun with terror. Could I go through this again? Or would I lose my mind this time? I glanced out the window. The neighborhood kids were laughing and running across their yards, and young mothers chatted leisurely, living that ordinary life I once took for granted. How I envied their peace, their ignorance of the shadows lurking at the edges of existence. Time flew by faster than I anticipated. On Monday, I climbed back into my car, casting one last look at the note, and drove to the designated address. Nothing had changed. John was already there, annoyingly punctual, exuding that familiar cold confidence. He slid into the back seat, eyeing the new seat covers with a smirk, as if the detail amused him. "Drive," he ordered, and I obeyed, cursing my own helplessness. We drove a few miles in heavy silence before he gave me a new address. This time we were headed to a quiet residential neighborhood, with well-kept lawns and beautiful houses. My insides knotted tighter with every passing moment. Curiosity and fear warred inside me until I couldn't contain myself any longer. "What kind of creature are you?" "Are you a werewolf?" I asked, my voice trembling but desperate. John smirked, staring out the window. "That's what people call us," he replied coolly. I swallowed, mustering the courage to ask more. "How old are you? Are you immortal?" He didn't answer that, and tension coiled around me like a noose. I dared to ask one last question. "Are there many of you?" This time, he turned his head and flashed a menacing smile. "Enough to reach your mother," he said, his voice ice cold. I froze, the threat sinking in like a knife. No more questions. We soon arrived at our new destination, a large two-story house that clearly belonged to a well-off family. It was almost midnight, but lights still glowed from the windows. I could see children running and playing inside, their laughter drifting out. A woman, their mother, was setting the table in the living room, the warmth of a family scene making my heart clench. Is he really going to attack this family? There are kids in there. John didn't leave the car right away. He watched the house for a few moments, like a predator sizing up its prey. Then he opened the door. I couldn't stop myself. "Are you going in there?" I asked, my voice cracking with fear. "There are kids. You said you don't hurt the innocent." This time, he didn't smile. His face turned grim, devoid of any emotion. "That's none of your business," he snapped. "Stay here and keep the engine running. That's all you're good for." With that, he got out and headed toward the house. I remained glued to my seat, paralyzed. I watched the windows, where the children still played, oblivious to the nightmare about to befall them. I couldn't take it. As much as I loved my mother, I couldn't just sit here and let him slaughter children. I had already let 2 women die, and the guilt haunted me every night. But now, this was a family, with kids. The conflict in my mind spun violently, fear battling with a surge of rage. Then suddenly I felt a surge of determination. There was no time to think. I grabbed the pump-action shotgun I'd hidden under the seat and jumped out of the car. My heart raced. My knees shook. But I knew I had to act. I couldn't let this monster kill them. John had already slipped into the house, and with the shotgun gripped tight, I followed, feeling each step echo through my veins. John moved like a creature that defied human anatomy, silent and predatory. I crept after him, watching as he climbed effortlessly through an unlocked window, like a giant, malevolent cat. His movements were smooth and deliberate, each one a testament to his deadly nature. I approached the front door, clutching the shotgun, and to my disbelief, found it unlocked. Why do people leave their doors open? The thought crossed my mind, drenched in fear and adrenaline. I stepped into the dark hallway, my breathing ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. Shadows stretched across the floor, and a soft light from the living room painted a thin strip of brightness ahead of me. I moved forward, careful not to make a sound, and pressed myself against the bedroom door. From there I could see John beginning his transformation. His body contorted, fur sprouting thickly over his skin, his face elongating into a wolfish snout, long fangs protruding from his mouth. His clothes tore apart, though shreds of fabric still clung to him. Meanwhile, the children kept playing in the living room, their laughter blissfully unaware of the horror creeping toward them. Their mother stood by the fireplace, adjusting some candles, the picture of serene domesticity. John, now a towering werewolf, stalked toward the partially open living room door. He reached out with a massive clawed hand and slowly pushed it open. One of the kids noticed him, froze, and then let out a piercing, heart-wrenching scream. In the adjoining room, my hands trembled, but I raised the shotgun and aimed it at the monster. The distance was short, and I prayed my aim would be true. The werewolf stepped forward, and I pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the quiet, the roar of the gun reverberating through the house. Blood and bits of flesh splattered the walls, and the beast howled in agony. Part of its head had been blown apart, but it remained standing, its animal eyes filled with a vengeful fury. The creature's bellow shook the walls, and I realized I had only made it angrier. It lunged at me, and I fired again. The second shot hit its chest, but it kept coming. I leapt aside, firing shot after shot until the shotgun clicked empty. The werewolf let out a bone-chilling roar and, still relentless, charged. Panicking, I bolted down the hallway, frantically reloading as I ran. The chase was on. I could feel its breath hot on my neck, hear its claws gouging deep grooves into the floor. Each shot I fired bought me mere moments, but the beast never stopped. I crashed through the front door and out into the cold night, the icy air burning my lungs. The werewolf followed, its silhouette monstrous under the moonlight. I'm running out of ammo, I thought, gritting my teeth, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I fired my last round, but it only infuriated the creature further. I threw the empty shotgun aside and ran with every ounce of strength left, my legs trembling with exhaustion and terror. I could feel it closing in, its breath nearly on my neck. This is the end, I thought, silently saying goodbye to my mother, whispering words of love and regret. I ran until my legs gave out. I tripped over something and crashed to the ground, pain lancing through my knee. I turned over to see the werewolf looming over me, its fangs bared in a vicious grin. It approached slowly, savoring its victory. I was at its mercy, its prey. The predatory gleam in its eyes promised no escape, and I knew there was no way out. The terror was absolute. The creature loomed over me, its eyes blazing with a wild, hungry light. It coiled, ready to spring, and I thought this was the end. Everything inside me clenched with terror, and I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for a swift, brutal death. I could feel its breath closing in, the anticipation of being torn apart gripping me like a vice. But then, suddenly, the air was shattered by gunfire. One shot, then another, then a third. My eyes flew open just as the deafening blast of another round rang in my ears. The monster was thrown backward, its massive body jolted and racked with the impact of the bullets. People in uniform surrounded it, rifles in hand, firing with professional precision. The werewolf bellowed, a roar of rage and pain, as its body writhed under the relentless onslaught. The gunfire seemed endless, and soon the beast collapsed to the ground. Its menacing growls faded, and I watched, stunned, as it bled out, reverting into a twisted, nearly lifeless husk of what was once John. There was almost nothing left of the creature that had haunted my nightmares. I stood there, frozen, unable to process that it was finally over. Is this really the end? My mind struggled to accept the reality, and I still felt my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to escape my ribs. Though I was saved, the fear still clung to me like a shadow. One of the men in black tactical gear approached, extending a gloved hand. I grabbed it, and he pulled me to my feet. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice muffled by a mask. His words were meant to reassure me, but my knees continued to tremble. I glanced around, taking in the chaos unfolding around me. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights rolled in, and the area buzzed with activity. People in protective suits emerged from vans, carefully sealing up John's body, now just a human form, though still marred with distorted inhuman features. It all felt surreal, like a scene from some bizarre movie. A familiar figure approached me, and I recognized him immediately. Richard Hale, the same man who had come to my door before. He looked at me with a faint, approving smile. "I'm glad you made the right choice," he said calmly. But I couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down my face as a wave of guilt crashed over me. I started confessing everything. How I had let John kill. How I had kept silent out of fear for my mother. and how that fear had gnawed at me, tearing me apart from the inside. Richard listened patiently, his expression composed and understanding. "Anyone in your position would have done the same," he said after I finished, his tone gentle yet firm. "But in the end, you found the strength to fight back. That matters." His words offered a strange sense of comfort, though they still felt unreal. He went on, "We'll take care of everything. This case will remain classified, and all we'll need from you is a signed non-disclosure agreement." I nodded numbly, barely comprehending. All I wanted was for the nightmare to be over. "What are these creatures?" I asked, my voice still shaking. "Are there really more of them out there?" Richard sighed and gave a slight nod. "Yes, they're out there, hiding among us. It's our job to make sure ordinary people don't ever have to face them. We're sorry you had to go through this. We should have found him sooner." I listened, the weight of his words sinking in. I now carried knowledge of things most people couldn't even fathom, secrets that would keep anyone awake at night. But along with that realization came a sense of relief. I was free. The burden that had crushed me for days had suddenly lifted. I cast one last look at the van carrying John's body away and remembered his chilling words. Yes, people can fight back. And even though the world was still full of monsters, I knew that this time I had managed to stand my ground.